And this week's update from Dorchester, we'll hear about a milestone on the way to recovery for a new housing development, as well as an effort to get more funding for UMass Boston. And joining us is the news editor of the Dorchester Reporter, Jennifer Smith. Thank you very much for being with us, Jen.
Of course.
First of all, talk about this milestone for a building we thought was destroyed last June.
Yeah, so I mean, if you've been anywhere near Ashmont Station, you saw this building, this 6-story building right across from the Caruth building. And last June, because of an issue with the generator exhaust pipe setting a fire on the roof, the whole thing pretty much, well, it didn't burn down, but the blaze lasted for about 16 hours, and it just decimated the roof and the top story and really caused a lot of people to wonder if it was ever going to come back, because it was a wood-framed building. So to reconstruct it, they pretty much had to knock the whole thing down to its concrete base and start all over again. But to a lot of people's relief, the developers of it, Trinity Financial, said almost immediately after the fire, no, this is a thing that matters. It's a project that we value. It's something that we've worked with the community on. And most importantly, it was a project that didn't displace anyone. This is something that a lot of folks cared about. It was built on top of the old Ashmont Tire building. So it was adding housing and adding new commercial space where there wasn't really anything before. So when they came back right away and said, not only are we going to rebuild this the same way we did before, and hopefully keep an eye on the generators this time and get those sprinklers primed and ready to go. But they also made sure that their anchor tenant, American Provisions, stuck around to kind of, again, just energize that base level of the building.
And at least a certain amount of this housing is fairly affordable, too.
Yes, 51% of 51 of these units, there's some 80-ish units, and the middle floors of them are all for residents who make 60% or less of area median income. The condos, the ownership units, are sold at market rate price, but because there had been people assigned to it through the lottery system for the affordable units, a really nice thing as well was they said, look, we're going to be respecting all of the lottery numbers. It's possible that you'll find somewhere else to live in between the reconstruction, but if you were on that list, if you were set up for one of those units, they were going to respect that.
We're used to hearing about developments like this nowadays, but if you go back 20 years ago, Dorchester Avenue, it was bars and automotive businesses, and now we've got all this transit-oriented housing, and even more in the pipeline.
Yes, that's exactly right. The Treadmark, I mentioned the Caruth building, it's a sister building right next door. And when you talk to, say, the Main Streets groups down there, they talk about how, yeah, we're in this housing crunch right now, we need to get units in, but at the same time, they want to kind of turn it into this commercial district that wasn't there before. And it's been an interesting partnership between the community and also with these developers to really kind of take advantage of these spots that had been these disused industrial locations and put in housing and putting new commercial space right on top of the red line, really.
I return to UMass Boston. After the injury of budget cuts, you have the insult of the Mount Ida acquisition by UMass Amherst, and Nick Collins. He's probably going to be the new state senator. He's trying to do at least a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Nick Collins, it is interesting where I chatted with the representative the other day about this, and we were kind of joking that he might have the unique opportunity to see the budget process from both sides of the legislative body if he is elected on May 1st to be the next state senator. So his area as it stands right now is South Boston and kind of the top corner of Dorchester, and includes the UMass Boston area. And so one thing that he's been really worried about is he's been watching these discussions about Mount Ida. UMass Boston was, everyone is aware at this point that they're saddled with kind of an amorphous amount of structural debt and deficits from expansion. It's kind of hard to put a number on it exactly, but Nick Collins and some other local Dorchester representatives were trying to see if they could wheedle out a way in the budget to ensure that the centers at UMass Boston were protected. And they initially thought they were going to do that by putting $2.1 million of new funding into the budget to specifically protect some centers. And in fact, what made it into a consolidated amendment was a different kind of protection, where they said all of these centers at UMass Boston need to be funded at the same levels as 2018. That's just a given. And in the unexpected or disastrous circumstance where UMass Boston does decide that it needs to close the center, it has to give a thorough report on why. It has to be 60 days before any closures or cuts, and they have to basically list out all of the reasonable steps that they've taken to try and mitigate that from closing in the first place. So Nick Collins says it's a really solid protection for those centers. And again, we'll see if it makes it through the Senate side, but it looks like it's in good shape in the House.
This has been on news. We're talking with Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter. Jennifer, the current president of the City Council, Andrea Campbell, she's working on a new public safety initiative. She recently played a key role in the adoption of body cameras by the Boston Police, and now she's looking at diversity on the police and fire department.
Yeah, it's no surprise really for, as the discussion has happened lately over the quality of policing in the city, and that potentially being related to how well it represents the community that it serves. Well, the demographic differences extend beyond the police department. The fire department is nowhere near as representative of the communities it serves. Since about, I think it was for the last 2 censuses, the city of Boston has been a majority minority city. So it means that more people of color exist in the city of Boston than white people in the city. But the police and fire departments and EMS as well tend to be majority white. I believe the fire department itself is something around 70%. And that's not at all in line with the rest of the city. And so Andrea Campbell now saying, look, we have these $2 million that are going to be going for a rollout of the body camera pilot program. Let's turn our attention to the way that public safety agencies function in general and how best to serve a community. Because if you look at studies, basically looking at demographics and how that impacts community relations. When you have a police force or a fire department or an EMS force that represents the city, you find a greater incidence of trust, and that makes it easier ultimately for these responders to do their jobs. So she's calling for a hearing to say, let's look at the discrepancies as they stand now and what concrete protocols can be put in place to try and bring it up.
Campbell, of course, is also the district councilor for part of Dorchester and Mattapan. She's concerned about zoning issues, the way district councilors usually are, and one of them is in Codman Square. Tell me what's going on with that.
Yeah, so if you recall a few weeks ago, we talked about, or I guess a month ago or so, we talked about the strange incidents of Codman Square Popeyes, which was initially rejected by the Zoning Board of Appeals. They wanted to build out a takeout restaurant. And the community said, great, awesome, we didn't want this, and it was denied with prejudice at the zoning board. That should be it, right? And it turned out that the Popeyes changed their permitting request with just a few tweaks to be a takeout restaurant or to be a sit-down restaurant, saying that 75% or less of their profits would be from takeout. Now, the reason this matters is that tweak meant that they could build as of right. And as of right zoning is a confusing concept for a lot of people, but it basically means that there are certain things that you can just build on your property. That's what they're zoned for. It's totally fine. You don't need to go through initial approval processes for it, and there isn't any community notification process. So Andrea Campbell, looking at this Popeyes situation, by the way, even though it was constructed, the licensing board did reject in early April their application for a common victualer's license. So you've got kind of a weird situation where the building is built, but they can't sell anything. So there's a whole other discussion about what that does to a community. But specifically, Andrea Campbell and Councilors Wu and Janey hosted a hearing the other night at the Codman Great Hall to kind of start to parse for the neighbors and with the Inspectional Services Department, what is the protocol with as-of-right zoning, especially if it's kind of been used with the letter of the law to circumvent the spirit of the law in zoning. So that's going to go into working sessions right now, but it's been kind of an interesting discussion as community members try and parse that.
And I do need to be reminded, for people in the neighborhood, what was the problem with Popeyes? Was it the food or just the traffic?
Well, traffic's always a problem, but one thing that was specific to Codman Square, and the reason that the neighborhood development groups and the community groups and the health organizations nearby were concerned was there are already 4 fast food restaurants right there, and Dorchester is in many ways, in parts, a food desert. So there aren't a lot of healthy options nearby, and there was just this concern that it didn't really jive with what the neighborhood was going for in the first place. And if there was a reason for it to go before the Zoning Board of Appeals, as it did before, then neighbors kind of get to make their voices heard, and the city gets to determine whether that's the best use for the property. But if they're just building it through as of right, there can be a conflict between what's allowed to be built and how people feel about it.
And of course, someone is filling maybe what you might call an upscale hamburger desert.
The upscale hamburger desert in question, I suppose, would be the fact that Wahlburgers, who, of course, it's from the Wahlbergs, who are a Dorchester family, they're opening their first restaurant in Dorchester, finally. It's like their 20-something chain of opening for it. But they're going to be putting it in the South Bay Mall, so it's going to be right next to the new AMC Theater, right across from a new Japanese barbecue place. You got Nike, you've got Ulta. And so a few members of the Wahlberg family did come out and celebrate it by bringing out a food truck that's going to be a little bit of a staple in the area until they get going.
And finally, every time you come on, there are more people running for something, including DA. What are we up to now, 7?
We're up to 7. There are 6 Democrats who are running for the Suffolk DA race. Most recently is a Charlestown attorney, John Kerry, and he joins Rachel Rawlings, Evandro Carvalho, Shannon McAuliffe, Greg Henning, and Linda Champion, who are already all running for the Democratic primary in September. That's if they all make the ballot on May 1st. And then we also have a Michael Maloney who's running as unenrolled. So if he meets the signature barrier, the 1,000 signatures you need to get on the ballot, then he will definitely be on the final November ballot. But people only have like 5 more days if they want to try and get their name in there.
And of course, people can always find the updates by going to the website for the Reporter and your own Twitter feed. So let's tell people what that is.
Yeah, so you can find us online at .news.com, follow us at .news, or follow me at jen.smith.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Of course, thanks, Chris.
Jennifer Smith from the Dorchester Reporter.